our time away, so it was fantastic. So thank you for your prayers, and we've been hearing some good reports, and we've had some of you texting us and various things about what God's been doing, so it's been fantastic. But hey, today we're continuing our series, Jonah, on the book of Jonah. And Pastor Nathan shared last week. I believe he did a fantastic job. I did watch the message, and but we joined the series. It's only a short book, Jonah. It's only 4 chapters long in the Old Testament, but there's some powerful truths that we can learn there about what it means to respond to God's mission, but then how do we deal with our humanity that sometimes that can be at odds with following what God wants us to do. How many of you have kind of just always, 100% of the time, always find it easy just to respond to what God is asking you to do? I don't think any one of us, including myself, there's always sometimes times where we've got to wrestle with our humanity. And Jonah is a great example of that. And we know the book starts by God calling Jonah and outlining his mission to him in Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, and said, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. And so he gets this great mandate, this great mission, this great thing that God has called him to do. But the story takes an unexpected twist, because Jonah does the very thing that he wasn't supposed to do. He actually refuses to do what God was asking of him. I wonder how many times we can see ourselves in Jonah. Actually, sometimes we ourselves are in that very position. And he tries to outrun God and what God was wanting him to do. And he hardtails it to a place called Joppa to catch a ship to another place called Tarshish, which was as far away as what was known at that time. And Tarshish was a place that was known for its gold and silver trade. And what's interesting about that is that the call and mission of God sometimes doesn't always look as flashy and as attractive as other things. And it can be easy sometimes when other things are calling you to turn a deaf ear to whatever God is calling you to do, and to try and actively run the opposite way like Jonah did. But Jonah discovered, and you and I will discover as well if we do this, is that there's always a price to pay to do that. Jonah, it says Jonah went down to Joppa and paid the price to board the ship. Now, I don't want to create a whole theology out of that, but there's something there, is that there's always a price to pay when you run away from God's purpose for your life. There's always a price that you're going to have to pay. That price might be a lack of peace in your life. That price may be that you're not going to feel satisfied and fulfilled because you're not doing the thing that God has called you and created you to do. Maybe the price is going to be in a disconnectedness from God and His presence. And we end up running from God and what He's called us to do, and running to things that look shiny and attractive. But they can never deliver what God, and when we respond to God's call, will give you. I want you to think about this, is that Jonah went down to Joppa. You don't go up when you run away from God's purpose. You go down. Jonah didn't go up a mountain. He went down to Joppa and paid a price. And there's principles in there that I think are good for us to understand, is that running from God's purpose for your life is not the best choice. Jonah's trip, when we read the story, is cut short by a vicious storm that was actually sent by God. Because God's actually kind of saying, I don't want you to be running from me. And so He sends this storm. And even when He was asked by the hardened sailors that were on the ship that He was on for deliverance, for Him to pray for their deliverance from the storm, He refuses. He's so kind of caught up in this thing of running from God. He may even have been aware that he was doing the wrong thing. And he refuses to pray, despite the fact that he was going to put all of those that were on the ship in jeopardy. And they realized their predicament, the sailors, because Jonah had actually told them that he was actually running from God. So he'd even been up front with those. He says, I'm running from God, that's why I'm on the ship. How audacious. Actually saying, no, I'm actually running from God. And I think sometimes being honest with God, being honest is actually not a bad thing. Actually, sometimes we try and cover up things with religious words and religious things to try and explain away why we're not doing the very thing that God has called us to do. But at least Jonah's honest. He says, no, I'm running from God. Because I think God can do something with that. And there's something in there. And so they ask him, they say, well, what should we do? You're running from God. What do we need to do? And he says, well, maybe you should throw me into the sea. And I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he was thinking that, oh, I'm just going to drown. I'm running from God. There's no way back for me. I realize that I'm too far down this road. Everyone else is now being affected. Everyone else is at risk of losing their life. And so I might as well just throw me into the sea and let it be done. And so they kind of deliberate, because they kind of go, we don't want to throw you into the sea in the midst of the storm. You're going to die. And they deliberate until eventually it got to a point where they eventually said, look, there's no other way. And they throw Jonah into the ocean, and the sea immediately becomes calm as Jonah did that. Jonah's then swallowed by a huge fish. And some of you think it was a whale. The Bible actually doesn't say it was a whale. Could have been a whale. But actually it doesn't say it was a whale. It just says it was a huge fish. And he remains there for 3 days and 3 nights. And while he's there in the belly of this great fish, he comes to his senses and he cries out to God. And the fish eventually spews him out alive onto dry land. And he sets about reconnecting with the mission that God had spoken to him, to go to Nineveh and to command God's people to turn back to God. As a result, 120,000 people in the city of Nineveh repented and came back to God. And you would think that Jonah would be rejoicing. You would think, actually, hey, this is amazing. But he struggles with his emotions and his humanity. And the book ends in chapter 4 with God taking Jonah through a series of questions that were aimed firstly at him learning about himself, his own humanity and his own areas of growth. But secondly, also learning about God's nature and God's purpose, and how God's purpose should always trump our desires. So these 4 little chapters, I've just given you a synopsis of the book of Jonah. These 4 little chapters are packed full of things that are going to help us. And so I've entitled my message this morning, Remember. And we're going to read from the last verse of chapter 1 and read through chapter 2 to chapter 2, verse 10. It says, now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very hearts of the sea, and your currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I've been banished from your sight, and yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath me barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. And my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. This is a pivotal point in Jonah's story in his life, where he begins to realize the foolishness of trying to outrun God and God's purpose and God's plan for our lives, and where he remembers who he is, where he remembers who God is, and where he also remembers what God's plan and purpose for his life was. So there's a lot of remembering that's kind of going on here. And I'm not sure if you're sitting here today, if you're watching us online, whether you're able to say for sure that you're living in the fullness of God's call and mandate for your life. For some of you, you may be. And you might know the joy and the peace and the fulfillment and the sense of destiny that comes with that. You would know how that fills there every day with purpose. You would know the excitement of that, living in that place. But for some, if you're honest, you may be doing more of a Jonah. You may actually find yourself actually doing more of a Jonah. You've heard God's call. You know that He's got things in store for you. There's a bigger mission for your life. You even call yourself a Christian, but you're doing everything that you can to run from what God has called you to do. You're doing a Jonah. That's kind of almost, I think, would be a good phrase for us. Are you doing a Jonah? It's a good thing to ask one another. Ask yourself, am I doing a Jonah? Am I doing a Jonah? Because some of us can be in that place, and other things are competing for our attention. Other things are competing for our priorities. Other things are competing for our time, our talents. And we're following the call of those things. Remember, Jonah was on his way to Tarshish, a place of silver and gold. He was following attractive things while he was running from the things of God. If that's you, and you know that you're doing a Jonah, it's not my job to tell you you're doing a Jonah. It's our job to self-assess and say, God, am I doing a Jonah? Then today and over the series, this could really be a pivotal time for you. Just like this moment was a pivotal moment for Jonah. This prayer of Jonah that we've just read actually shows that Jonah was a man who had a deep love for God, who had a deep love for His word. He actually quotes from this prayer from a number of the Psalms, so he knows the word of God. He knows God. He knows, and you can be a person who loves God. You can love God's word deeply. You can pitch up to church week in and week out. But the bigger question is, are you truly on about what God has called you to be on about? Because Jonah had all that other stuff going for him, but he was still running from God. And what I know is that we've all been saved on purpose, for purpose. You've been saved by Him on purpose, for purpose. And so what can we learn from this prayer of Jonah's? What can we learn from his life? What might we need to remember in order for us to help us to live on mission and to live according to the purpose that He has us? My first point is simply this, is that God will make a way. You know, in chapter 1, verse 17, it says that the Lord provided a large fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Many have debated whether this was an actual fish. People have historians and something like a whale, or whether it was simply a poetic symbol. I personally like to take the Bible at what it says. Especially when you begin to understand what the purpose of this account of Jonah is all about. The messaging is clear, is that when we're not on about what God desires us and created us to be on about, He will always provide a way back for us. And if you're finding yourself even here today as I'm speaking, saying, I realize I'm doing a Jonah, well, you need to know that God has provided a way back for you. It's not hopeless. There's a way back for you. Remember what I said when Jonah said to them, throw me over the side, and that, I think he was probably thinking, well, that'll be the end of it for me and everything will be done. But God provided a way. He sent a great fish in order for him to reconnect with what God had done. And just like over and over in the scriptures, we see God using miraculous things that are beyond the normal, the things that are divine in their origin and purpose, to reconnect people with Him and the purpose that He has for their lives. Think of things like the burning bush. Think of the water coming out of the rock. Think of the pillar of fire. Think about the tongues of fire on people on the day of Pentecost. Think about the miracles of healing when Jesus was walking the earth. And just like He uses those things, so we find Him doing the same thing here in the life of Jonah. It's interesting that Jesus Himself refers to this event and says this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. He said these words, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. He was talking about Himself. And this connection between Jonah and Jesus is one that we must not miss, because it's powerful. Because Jonah was foreshadowing the greater work that Jesus was going to come and do through His own death and resurrection. Jonah was a great historical figure, but there was one who was greater than Jonah that was to come, and it was Jesus Himself. Jonah's imperfections, and he had many, actually point to Jesus' perfection. Jesus came to fulfill God's mission, whereas Jonah tried to run from it. Jonah wrestled with the tug and pull of his humanity, but Jesus willingly surrendered his humanity to God's will. Jonah struggled to see beyond the immediate impact of what God was calling him to do and the impact it would have on himself. He was just thinking about himself, but Jesus denied himself and gave his all for us all because he saw what lay beyond the cross. He saw you. He saw me. Jonah spent 3 days and nights alive inside a large fish. Jesus spent 3 days and nights dead in a grave. This fish spewed Jonah alive onto dry ground, but the grave gave up the dead body of Jesus as he came back to life and rose from the dead and conquered sin and death once and for all. When Jonah ultimately responded to God's call, it saved 120,000 in Nineveh, but Jesus' mission when he came was for all mankind. From every nation, every tribe, every tongue, for all to be saved and to come to a knowledge of him. God made a way for Jonah. And through Jesus, he has made a way for you and I to connect back with the purpose that he has with our lives. Today could be your great fish moment. Who likes fishing? Any fishermen amongst us? How many of you are good fishermen? Not so many hands go up. You know, as you love about fishermen, they're always living for the next catch. It's like golf. It's what gets you going back, you know. But what we see here is that today could be your great fish moment. If you've been running from God, running from his purpose, you need to know that we might try and outrun God, but God does not run from us. He has made a way possible for us to get back on track, to reconnect with the mission and the purpose that he has for your life. And even if you have been running from him, you're not lost. It's not too late. Today could be your great fish moment. It could be the day that you actually begin to reconnect with God's purpose. And that leads me to my second point, which is this, is that your prison can be the gateway to freedom and destiny. In verse 2, verse 1, he says, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord and his God and said, in my distress I called to the Lord and he answered me. From the depth of the realm of the dead I called for help and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very hearts of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. We know that when he was asked by the sailors to pray for their safety, he did not. He was so preoccupied with self and running from God's purpose. But now that he finds himself captive in the belly of this great fish in the depths of the sea with no way of saving himself, he does the one thing that he knows what to do, and he prays and he calls out to God. You know, when you're in a prison, that's a good thing to do. When you don't know how to turn or what to do or where to go, a good thing to do is just to cry out to God. He's in the business of hearing the cries of those that are desperate. And what should have been a tomb for Jonah ends up actually becoming the gateway to life. The nation of 3 days and 3 nights is not just arbitrarily put in there. It was actually culturally significant because it was considered the time where someone was actually was considered confirmed to be dead. Jonah could have succumbed to that narrative. He could have actually succumbed and an inevitable death that came with it. But instead, the tomb became a womb. The tomb became a womb. Where it seemed like, oh, it's too late for you. It's too far gone. You've run from God too much. There's too much water under the bridge. There's too much history. There's too much. You can't come back. What we find with Jonah is that the tomb becomes a womb. And it became the place of new life in his life. If you feel like you may be in a prison of sorts, maybe it's a prison of doubt, maybe it's a prison of fear, maybe it's a prison of self and your own humanity, maybe it's a prison of defeats and failure, maybe it's a prison of distraction, a prison of your past or your present, a prison of doubt, maybe it's the prison of mediocrity. But Jonah shows us, the life of Jonah, the account of Jonah shows us that what could have been a tomb actually becomes a womb. A place for new life.
And Jonah prays this in verse 6. He says, to the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. Man, Jesus is the answer to whatever pit you might find yourself in. Whatever prison you find yourself in. You see, we have a choice to focus on your prison or to focus on Jesus. Making the prison the focus of your attention leads to death. Death of vision, death of purpose, death of peace, death of joy, death of hope, death of calling. But focusing on Jesus as the center leads to life, leads to freedom, leads to joy, leads to peace. He breathes new life into your vision, into your purpose, new life into your heart, new life into your present, new life into your future. Jesus himself said these words in John 10 verse 10. He says, the thief comes only in order to steal, kill, and destroy. Speaking about the devil. But he says, I came that they may have and enjoy life and have it in abundance to the full till it overflows. I love that. God doesn't want you just to have a little bit of good life. He wants you to have abundant life. He wants you to know abundant life. He wants you to know overflowing life. And that's what happens when we get to be on about what God has created us to be on about. Is that you begin to live in that abundant life. When you're on about that mission, that kind of life will transform you. That kind of life will transform your marriage, your relationships, your workplace. In fact, every part of your life. It's what you were created for. But you might say, well, how do I access that, Matt? Well, that leads me to my third point, which is that we've been given the keys to connect us with God's purpose again. Verse 7, Jonah says, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. And my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. I see four things that Jonah did here that helped him turn his prison into a womb. And now all of a sudden, what did he do? The first thing he did, he got honest with where he was at. He got honest. He got brutally honest about, he knew his life was ebbing away. He knew it was draining out of him. He knew he was running from God. And that I want to say to you, the start of reconnecting with God's purpose and mission for your life has to start with honesty about where we're at. Because sometimes I think the biggest person we're trying to fool is ourselves. And we're trying to convince ourselves, oh, no, that's all good. But the reality is we're not doing the very thing that we know that God created us to do. What I love about honesty is that you're not going to surprise Jesus with anything. He already knows. He already knows where you're at, where I'm at. We're not going to surprise him. He loves it, in fact, when we get honest and we get real, because that's the foundation of where he can do his best work. And so he gets honest about where he's at, but secondly, he remembers. Isn't it funny how easy it can be to forget what God has done for us? You might have been a Christian for many years. You've grown up in a Christian family. Maybe you've been around church in a long time, and yet you still find yourself in this place like Jonah is, where you're forgetting what God has done and you're running away from God's purpose. And when we allow other things to rise up against the knowledge of God, when we allow things like people, pursuits, or pennies to cloud our remembrance, we begin to lose sight. But what Jonah shows us is that when you remember what God has done, when you remember who we are outside of him, when we remember what he's spoken over our lives, and we begin to reconnect with that. That's why the Israelites of old, whenever there was a great victory, or whenever God did great things, they used to erect memorial stones. Firstly for themselves, but also for generations to come, to say, these stones speak about what God has done. Because we have an amazing ability sometimes to forget. And it was important because God said, you need to do that. Why didn't he do that? Because I want you to do that so that generations to come realize that this was not done in your own strength. This was done by God, working in you and through you. And so Jonah remembers, but then he does another thing, is that he then prays. And if you found yourself in a prison or a tomb, running from God's purpose, one of the most powerful things you got is prayer. Because prayer is where we connect with God's heart. Prayer is where we encounter His will. Prayer is where He molds us and shapes us. It's not just a religious activity. It's where He grows us. It's where we get what we need to do what He's calling us to do. Prayer is a place of surrender. It's a place of honesty. It's a place where we're empowered. It's a place where we connect with God, heart to heart and spirit to spirit. It's where our hearts are kept soft and responsive to God's leading. It's where I find vision. It's where I find courage. It's where I find boldness. It's where I find grace. It's where I find joy. It's where I find hope. Prayer is where we actively remember. But he doesn't just pray, he also praises. Praise is a decision, not a feeling. Some are saying, oh, I'm not really feeling it, and we don't praise. No, prayer is a decision that you make. Prayer is a sacrifice. Praise is a sacrifice that you bring. You praise your way out of a tomb. You praise your way out of a prison. We see that happening in the book of Acts. Paul and Silas praising their way out of prison. Beginning to say, God, I'm just going to declare your greatness, declare your majesty. And despite what my physical realities, what my heart may be saying to me, I'm going to choose to praise you. I'm going to lift up your truth. I'm going to declare the majesty and the might of who you are. I'm going to worship. I'm going to praise. And Jonah does all of these things. Honesty, remembrance, prayer, and praise. People moving around me. And the last point is this, and the musicians can come up now. They're lurking. Is that this last point about Jonah is that he understood the power of a vow. In verse 9 he says, what I've vowed I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. We live in an age, I think, where sometimes there seems to be little weight to a person's word anymore. There was a time when you could just say it and people could take it to the bank. If you said it, that's it, it's done. Some of you remember those days, those generational days where if it was said by someone, that's it. You could take it to the bank every time. A handshake was enough. Now, even though there's legal documents and all kinds of contracts and everything, it seems like it doesn't even matter anymore. All the time you hear in the footy world and all that kind of thing, it's like guys have got contracts and yet somehow they're able to break contracts and go places and all kinds of things and nothing happens. And we've lost the sense of what a vow is. Now, yes and no seems to mean maybe. And yet a vow, biblically, is a promise that's made between people before God that involves a commitment to certain actions, certain behaviors, certain attitudes. They're not made lightly. They're not entered into lightly. That's why, to me, marriage vows are so important, so critical, because when you make those vows, you're saying we're entering into this before God. It's weighty. It's serious. And when we give our lives to Jesus, we make a vow. A vow where we say God is a vow of commitment. It's a vow to surrender my life to you. It's a vow to honor you with my life, my lips, my life. And Jonah says, I'm going to make good on what I've vowed before the Lord. He says, because God, I know that salvation comes from you alone. None of those other things I've been chasing after are going to give me what you alone can give me. See, he's finishing a different way to how he started. He started running from God and his purpose from his vow, but now he's making a full circle and he's coming back to what he's always known, and he recommits himself to the vow that he made. See, even if you think that you haven't held up your part of the vow, and you've been running from God and his purpose, what I love about this is that even though we might renege on our vows, God never reneges on his. That's what the new covenant is all about. When God makes a covenant, and the new covenant, he doesn't turn his back and say, well, that's it, I'm done with you now. He says, no, 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 I don't turn my back on my vow. He never changes. He's always the same. 2 Timothy 2 verse 13 says it this way: if we are faithless, he remains faithful because he cannot disown himself. God's vow to you, to me, is without question. God never breaks his vow. Won't you stand with me, please?